In this lecture, we'll be talking about the structure of the Roman Republic. We discussed earlier how the Romans didn't just overthrow a single king, they overthrew monarchy itself. But Rome wasn't really that big at that time, right? It's basically just a powerful city-state. So we're not yet at the Roman Empire in the sense of a huge territory with multiple different groups of types of people. We're just at a little city-state for now. In order to understand how it's going to go on and expand, we need to look a little bit more closely, though, at how this society and government were structured. So we'll first look at the social classes, because social class determined, in many ways, the characteristics of the government. First, there were slaves. Now, we'll talk more about slavery later on in Rome. The institution of slavery and the presence of slaves is very important. In this time period, there's not that many. That will increase with the conquest. So we're not going to talk too much about them now, but they do become a political issue later on. While slaves were definitely at the bottom, at the top were what were called the patricians. You could think of these as aristocrats, elites, however you want to say it. They comprised about 5% of the population, right? The patricians comprised about 5% of Rome's population. The plebeians, the common people, occupied the 95% remaining. Now, I'm not including slaves in this number. I'm talking about free people. In this time period, there's not that many slaves. They're not so statistically significant. What I want to stress, though, here, even if these numbers, they're going to change over time and so forth, the patricians, the elites, comprise about 5% of the people. The plebeians, the common people who are like the farmers, the craftsmen, and comprise the majority of the army, they can make up 95% of the population. So there's definitely a kind of, hierarchy here, one in which you have a few people who are on top and a lot of people who are on bottom. And that's something we need to note because that's going to cause a lot of conflict. What makes things complex as well is the fact that it was, in a sense, possible if you were a patrician to lose your wealth. You would still be considered high status, but you wouldn't be very wealthy. And then it was also possible for plebeians to become wealthy, but you could not escape your status. So it didn't matter how wealthy you became as a plebeian for much of this, the Republic, you would never become a patrician. So these things are fixed by birth. And they didn't always match. And so sometimes what would happen is you'd have these complex cases where a poor patrician would marry a rich plebeian, right? The patrician needs money to maintain their social status. The plebeian has the money and hopes that by marrying a patrician, their social status will go up. And that's going to cause conflict because, this kind of blurs the lines between these distinctions. And when your privileges come from you being part of a certain status group, as we'll talk about momentarily, you don't want any blurring of lines. You want it to be very clear that you're a patrician and that no one else is, so that you can keep your privileges. So one thing I want to note, you probably have seen a Roman flag before and you've seen the letters SPQR and maybe weren't familiar with what they meant, but in Latin it's Senatus Populusque Romanus, which means the Senate, que is and, people of Rome, right? The Senate and people of Rome. And in a sense, this doesn't work 100%, but you can kind of think about it like this. The patricians are the Senate. They control the Senate, at least the wealthiest do. And the plebeians are the people. So there's, even in the name, or the slogan rather, of Rome, that is meant to tie them together, they still maintain a distinction. So we're all Roman, but there's the Senate Romans and there's the people Romans. And so there's going to be conflict. There's going to be division. So when you think of Rome, it's kind of one thing where there's lots of Romans, but there's also divisions within it. And this goes to the political structure. So first of all, one thing I have to stress about Roman political structure, we could teach a whole class on just the Roman Republic. I mean, a whole semester. So we don't have a whole semester to talk about the Roman Republic. So one thing I just want to stress is what I'm going to say is just kind of a basic kind of outline. There are always going to be exceptions to the what I say. You'll always be able to find places where things changed. So I just want to note this is meant just to give you a basic idea so we can better understand what's going to happen to the Roman Republic later on. But one thing I want to note is you can see the dynamism of the Roman Republic and Roman civilization because it did change. They were flexible. They changed their form of government to meet their circumstances, which is one reason why democracy or democratic republics can be a good form of government. They allow you to change and be flexible when you need to. But first of all, and this is what I mean about this kind of tricky kind of marriage between the Senate and people of Rome, at first, high positions had to be filled by patricians, right? If you wanted to be in a high position in the Roman government, you generally had to be a patrician. Later on, basically, wealthy plebs, or plebeians, they're also called, would be able to get high positions. But early on, it's got to be filled by patricians. So to give you an example, remember we said the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate, which had a basically kind of a legislative function, which is why the United States Senate is called the United States Senate, it's copying off that. At first, you had to be a patrician to be a member of the Senate. Right, so that's why I said there's kind of, it's not 100%, but you can think the Senate are the patricians, the people is everyone else. And in this Senate, you served for life, and it was hereditary. So I don't want you to think like the senators are standing for election. They're not. If you are a senator, it's because you're a high-level patrician. Not every patrician's on the Senate, but you're a high-level patrician, and you are there. I think it's at the age of 30 you get to actually take your seat, and you're there forever. And I believe you may have heard the word like senile. It comes from a word related to old age. Senate literally is meaning like old men because they could serve for life. So most of them were quite elderly. There were also something called consuls. This kind of represented the executive branch. Now, they were interesting in a large part because there were two of them. There were two consuls. And remember how we talked about there would be like two kings in Sparta? It's the same kind of idea. You had two consuls so that they could veto each other. So one consul could veto the other one's decision. Now, a lot of times, one reason they also had two consuls was so that one could stay in Rome and take care of things in Rome while the other could go out in order to wage a military campaign or something like that. So you'd have one consul who was like the domestic consul who hung around in Rome and took care of things in Rome while the other one could go out and lead a military campaign or something like that. So it was kind of division of labor. Incidentally, if both consuls went out to lead a military campaign and they couldn't agree to what should be done, they would each take turns commanding the army. So like one guy would get the army Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The other guy would get the army Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and they would alternate Sundays. I'm not kidding. They actually did this. What's interesting too about the consuls, they only could serve for 1 year at a time. So you couldn't keep like extending it. So what I mean by this is you could be consul, you could be elected to be consul, and this was an elected office. And you could be consul for 1 year, and then you couldn't be consul, at least for another year. Sometime, again, the rules will change, especially as we'll see later, but the idea was you could only be consul for 1 year, and then you were done. Or at least you had to wait another year before running again. And the idea was to prevent anyone from getting too much power. Now, initially, and this is complex, they were elected from the Senate, but not by the Senate. In other words, the consul initially had to be a senator, which meant he had to be a patrician. I say he purposely because they were all men. Had to be a patrician. But then everyone, or all the people who were liable to vote, the citizens, again, would be men, they were the ones who would then vote. So for a consul had to be a senator. But it wasn't just the Senate that was choosing the consul. This was something that would be open to a much wider vote to include the citizens of Rome. This would eventually change, and a plebeian could be elected to be consul. But again, you can see there's that concentration of power in the Senate. though there is some consultation with other people as well. So this is all set up, you can see, to have a kind of checks and balances. We want an executive officer. You need one to actually do stuff, but we don't want him to be too powerful. So we're going to make it so there's two of them and they can veto each other. And I mean, they could veto each other, right? I want to stress that. The consuls could overturn each other's decisions and could keep an eye on each other. But what happens, and the idea that there is to prevent any one person from gaining too much power. Remember, Rome, the Republic started as a reaction against kingship, about saying that the one king, one person having too much power is going to become a tyrant. So we want to prevent that. So that's why you have these checks and balances. Remember, they had taken an oath that they would kill anyone who ever tried to become king. But what if you needed decisive action? Right? What if you needed decisive action? What if there was an emergency and you can't deal with that, which is this kind of cumbersome system? Well, in that case, they had what they called dictators. And this was, now today we use dictator as like an insult. We say, oh, that person's a dictator. Here it was an actual government office. And dictators were given absolute power temporarily. So you could do whatever you want for a month. And you may say, well, why wouldn't someone just keep being dictator? And that's a good point. That's eventually what happens. But for hundreds of years, that never happened. Everyone who became dictator dealt with the situation and would give up power after 1 month. And part of that was just the weight of tradition. Part of it was just the belief that that was the right thing to do. Part of it was also just remembering that Romans had promised that they would kill anyone who tried to make themselves king. And being a dictator is for life, or for longer than that, is kind of like trying to make yourself king. So you would probably get assassinated. So they stayed away from that for much of the Republic, till basically the very end almost. So what we have here is an aristocratic republic. It's not direct democracy in the same way that Greece was, right? It's less democratic than Greece was. But it does have certain democratic and, of course, republican ideals. We make a mistake, I think, if we compare it to what we have now. Comparing to what we have now, it's just not very democratic at all. But again, if you compare it to, say, Persia, or any of the Mesopotamian kingdoms, or ancient Egypt, or China, this is much, much more democratic. But it's a democracy really controlled by aristocrats, the patricians. Now, one thing I also want to note, and this gets really, really complex, so I'm going to try and simplify as much as possible. Remember how we talked about with the Greeks in Athens, that taking part in the democracy, to do that, you had to complete military training, and to complete military training, you had to supply your own equipment. So there was a connection between military service and political participation. It was the same for the Romans. Now, what's tricky is, and I won't go into detail here because it gets really complex. The Romans loved laws and they loved meticulous details. But basically, the wealthier you were, the better you could equip yourself. And the better you could equip yourself, the more political power you had. So even though basically the way their voting worked, the higher you were up in the military, and remember, in this time period in the Republic, all men basically served in the military. So it's not like it's just, a small group of military controlling everyone. It's not. It's like all guys. The higher you were up in the military, the more your vote counted. So there's a strong connection here between military service and political power. And the more wealth you had, the better equipment you could have. You could become, if you were wealthy enough to become heavy infantry like these guys, you had a good amount of political power. If you had enough money to become a cavalryman like this guy, you had even more political power. This guy is most likely a patrician, because only a patrician would probably have the wealth to be able to afford all this stuff. So, like I said, similarity with the Greeks, military service is connected to political power. The more money you have, the better gear you can afford, the higher up you're going to be in the military hierarchy, the more power you're going to have in the government. Now, I need to give you an illustration of Roman values to tell you the story of Cincinnatus. I think it gives us a strong idea about how the Romans understood their world and how the Republic worked. So Cincinnatus, and by the way, Cincinnati, Ohio is named after Cincinnatus, was a patrician. And he believed very much in the power of the patricians. He was no friend of the plebeians. He thought the patricians should hold power and they should keep it. And his son basically went around fighting with plebeians. His son would go around beating him up and stuff. And his son got in trouble for fighting with plebeians. And Cincinnatus, I'm being really anachronistic here, but to keep the story so it makes sense, basically Cincinnatus bailed out his son, right? Cincinnatus' son was going around beating up plebeians, beating up the common people. And so he got arrested, and Cincinnatus bailed him out. And Cincinnatus' son promptly jumped bail and just ran off. So Cincinnatus was disgraced by this, that his son had left. And so Cincinnatus, who was on the Senate, by the way, was left Rome to go to his farm and to work. And that's Cincinnatus right there. Now, while this was going on, or shortly after this went on, Cincinnatus is back on his farm, Rome was invaded and sent out an army to fight the invaders, and the army was destroyed. And they were in a really serious problem. There was a really serious, this is a very serious problem, right? Our army's been defeated. We need someone to solve the problem. We need a dictator, right? We're in an emergency situation. We need a dictator. So they call Cincinnatus. So these are senators who have gone to Cincinnatus and are asking him to become dictator. And they're carrying with them what were called the fasces. You can see there's like an axe and it's surrounded by rods. Basically, the idea is you use the rods. If someone does something wrong, you use the rods to beat them. If they do something really, really wrong, you use the axe to cut off their head. And these fasces, by the way, this is where we get the word fascism from, are a symbol of authority that the dictator would receive. You can maybe see the connection there with fascism. So they're saying, hey, please, Cincinnatus, we kind of treated you bad. You've been disgraced, but we need you to save Rome. And so the story goes that Cincinnatus put down his plow, went out, defeated Rome's enemies, and put everything straight, got the city kind of reorganized, got them back on their feet. And then even before his month was up, he resigned and gave up power and went back to his plow and started working again. So Cincinnatus is held up then as a symbol of virtue. He could have used his power to try and enrich himself. He could have used his power to try and hurt his enemies. The only thing he used his power to do was to basically punish the people who had gotten his son into trouble. That was the one thing he couldn't resist doing. But other than that, like I said, he laid down power even before his month was up. And so he was taken by the Romans as a symbol of self-sacrifice for the state, right? I, Cincinnatus, I'm not going to look for revenge. I'm not going to look for wealth or power. My country needs me. Even if it treated me badly, it needs me. I'm going to serve my country. And what I think is fascinating is that Americans would portray George Washington as Cincinnatus, right? There you can see George Washington in a Roman toga. This is meant to show him following Roman values of love of country above your own self-interest. Here you can also see George Washington posing with the fasces, that symbol of authority I mentioned, though notice to show his kind of more peaceful, forgiving nature, he's actually covered the axe. And this is important. You may recall that George Washington, there were people who actually wanted to make him king. He became president twice and could have become president 3 times had he wanted to, but he refused to stand for office again. He did not want to continue in power because he thought that would be bad for the government. He needed to give someone else a chance, right? In a sense, to build up a democratic tradition. And so he's held up in the early American Republic by being compared to this figure from the early Roman Republic of what it means to be patriotic and to have so much love for your country that you would also be willing to give up power if it benefits your country. Now, I should also point out that there's always this kind of tension, or you could even say hypocrisy, where you had people like Washington who wanted liberty and freedom, but were also slaveholders. And as a historian, one thing I can tell you is that one reason that they did not see that tension, or what we may call hypocrisy, was because they were imitating the Romans, who were quite happy to have slaves while also claiming to believe in freedom. So we got a lot of good things from the Romans, I think. I think patriotism and love of country are great. The continuation of slavery was not. But that being said, we now have a better idea of the structure of the Roman Republic and, of course, its influence on the United States.